Hey, this is Andrew Brown from Exam Pro, and we are looking at stateful sets. Now, this is one of the few things in this course that I'm not doing a follow along with. I'm not showing you it hands-on because it's so hard to do, and it's out of the scope of the KCNA, and generally it's recommended not to run your databases in cluster, but using managed service. So for those reasons, I'll just provide the information here, so you generally have the know-how. Now, that doesn't mean that you will never have to do it. There might be some cases, but again, it's just out of the scope of this course. So stateful sets are used when you need traffic to be sent to specific pods. And the thing with stateful sets is they will always have a unique and predictable name and address, ordinal index numbers assigned to each pod, like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a persistent volume attached with a persistent link from pod to storage. If a pod is rescheduled, the original persistent volume will be mounted to ensure data integrity and consistency, because that's how you ensure state. Stateful set pods will always start in the same order and terminate in reverse order. So that's really important. Now, in order to implement stateful sets, it will require to use a headless service to manage identities. Headless services were really confusing. I can't tell you how much time I spent to try to make sense of them, but what I figured out is that headless services are generally used because of stateful sets. So there is a headless server service used to maintain the network identity of the pods, and another service that provides read access to the pods. And I have an architectural diagram. We'll walk through it. So here's an example of a stateful set. I'm going to get my pen out here. You can see there's a lot going on here, but we have stateful set at the top. Okay. And then there, it kind of looks like a deploy. So you have a match selectors to match to something. The replicas, like how many do you want to run? And where it kind of varies is that it has a mounted volume. So it's not like you can't mount a volume to a, a deployment replica set, what have you, but stateful sets would have a volume because they're usually for databases. So you definitely would want to have a volume attached there. So that here is my big fancy diagram. And so I have some accompanying text here that is from the documentation. And so what I'll do is read it out to you and then try to figure out how it matches up to the diagram. So the first thing is, when we're looking about stateful sets, we have a DNS hostname for writes. So writes will be, oh, sorry, I got to set up this scenario here. If you look here, what we have is a stateful set, and it's a Postgres database being deployed in cluster, okay? So the first thing is, for our stateful set of a Postgres database, is that writes will be directed to the main pod by its DNS hostname, which is identified by the headless service. So, you have in your web application, someone wants to write to the database. So the idea is that in order for us to know where this main pod is, we need this headless service so that we get a DNS record. And so it says main.psq, because we can't rely on IP address. We need to rely on that domain name or that DNS record. So that's what it will do to help it get there. Then the idea is we have cluster IP for read. So for read traffic, it can be distributed to all the reading pods using the cluster IP service. Now, this part of the course, we haven't covered all the different service types. So when you if you find this confusing, what you should do is watch the whole services section when you get to it, and then come back to this and look at this, because it is pretty darn complicated, to be honest. But anyway, so the idea here is that we want to do a read. We use a regular service like we would, the cluster IP. That's the default one. And that by default does load balancing at random. So here it doesn't matter because both the pods can read. And so it'll either go to the main pod or the read replica. Then you have the headless service. So the headless service is a service with cluster IP set to none, and it does not provide load balancing. It does not provide a static IP address. A headless service is used to identify specific pods by assigning them DNS records. That's all it does. It gives a nice DNS record so that we can identify what pod to send to, okay? A headless service is required in order to for a stateful set to work, and I've said that a few times here. Then we have our PVC and our PV. So persistent volume claim and persistent volume. Again, we haven't reached that section yet of the course, but we will. But the idea is that we do need to have some kind of storage because it is a database. And we said earlier in the previous slide that you'd want to retain that information. So if this main pod was destroyed and then a one was to take its place, this same volume here would get matched up. It wouldn't match up to some other random volume. It would ensure that this one matches with the main pod. So there you go.